For the last few years, there has been this debate that has raged in the comic book community over the belief that CBCS books sell for less than CGC books. And over the years, I've actually heard from a lot of people in the community that this value gap has narrowed. Personally, I'll tell you that I see no difference between the quality of a CGC book versus that of a CBCS book. Now, that's not to say that either one is perfect. It is to say that they both are respected companies that offer a quality product and a quality service to the comic book community. Up until recently, the value gap that exists or doesn't exist between CGC and CBCS hasn't been a huge concern for me. The reason being, I don't have a large number of CBCS books in my collection, and up until recently, I hadn't even submitted any books in to CBCS, but that of course changed when I sent off 4 books and they came back with some pretty solid grades. Again, this is not a slight against CBCS. When I decided which grading company that I wanted to go with a few years ago, I literally wrote out a pro-con list for both grading companies and landed on CGC and haven't looked back. And by and large, all of my submissions have gone that way, and then the books that I purchased tend to just be CGC books. Not a slight against CBCS, it is personal preference. You may have a completely different personal preference, and that's actually okay. So with my 4 books coming back from CBCS, that actually prompted me to start thinking about this value gap that I've been hearing about. And instead of taking people's word for it that this value gap has narrowed or that this value gap doesn't actually exist, I decided to do some research of my own. And technically, to get this done, I had to enlist the assistance of another YouTuber by the name of Matt Woods. And Matt actually came to my rescue, did all of the research for this project, and so I definitely want to acknowledge his contribution to this video. So what did we find with our research? We essentially found that CBCS books do indeed sell for less than CGC comics. And we did a relatively small sample, but again, the data will suggest that CGC books do sell for more, but not in every instance. And over the course of this video, what we're going to do is to dig into some of that data. We're going to look at all of the examples. We're going to talk about where CBCS actually went for more money than CGC, and again, where CGC books actually went for more. But before we get to that data, I actually want to ask you to do me a favor. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I want to invite you to go ahead and do that now. Just tap the button, turn on notifications, and that way you won't miss out on any of the content. With that said, let's get to the data. Regie here, and I want to thank you for checking out this video. As I alluded to a few moments ago, we looked at about 15 books, so a relatively small sample, but we wanted to have some diversity. So we actually pulled these books from different publishers and different time periods. We also looked at a wide range of grades from a 9.8 all the way down to a 4.5. Our goal was to find books that people were interested in, that had volume and also a number of sales. The other important thing was that we tried to find books from CGC and CBCS that were sold within a tight proximity of one another. As you know, the comic book market can be very dynamic, so a book that sells 1 month could be influenced by different marketplace dynamics than another book that sells just a few months later. Our goal was to try to get it as tight as possible, and in many instances we were pretty close. In other instances we were as many as 4 months apart, but we did the best that we could do. As I mentioned, one of the big challenges is that CBCS has graded a smaller volume of comics. And if you take the time to actually pull up a book in the population report for CBCS and compare it to a book from CGC, from the CGC census, you will see exactly what I mean. The volume is night and day in some instances, which created some challenges, but as I said, we've tried to negate as much of that as we possibly could by looking at a wide range of grades between the two companies. The other thing that I'll mention to you is that all of the data that we use in this video was actually pulled from Go Collect. The reason being is that Go Collect actually has sales data for both CGC and CBCS. One of the first books that we looked at was Spawn issue number 1, specifically a 9.8. The CGC version of this book sold for $204 on May 3rd, which was $102 more than the CBCS book, which sold for $102 on April 25th. The next book we looked at was also an image book. This one, GEIGER issue number 1, a 9.8. The CGC book sold for $21 more than the CBCS book. A CGC 9.8 sold for $46, whereas the CBCS sold months before for only $25. Next up was the incredibly popular Something is Killing the Children from Boom Studios. We specifically looked at an issue number 1, 9.8. A CGC copy sold for $949 on March 30th, and the CBCS book sold for $661 on March 17th. That's a $288 difference. Next up, Lock and Key issue number 1, 9.8. Time was definitely a factor for this book. A CBCS 9.8 sold in late 2020 for $179, and a CGC sold for $225 in March of 2022. The price difference, however, was only $46. The first appearance for Miles Morales has a pretty large delta between CGC and CBCS. A CBCS sold earlier this year for $2,650, and a CGC sold 4 months later for $3,400, representing a $750 difference between the two. The next comparison is an interesting one because the CBCS book actually sold for more. On February 21st, an ASM 129 5.0 from CBCS sold for $1,850. 6 days later, a CGC 5.0 sold for $1,502, which is just about $350 less. We also took a look at a couple of 9.0s that sold back in 2021. The CBCS book sold for $3,000 and the CGC sold for $4,000, a $1,000 difference in that case. We did a similar 5.0, 9.0 comparison for Fantastic Four 52, the first appearance of Black Panther, and the results were similar. The 5.0 CBCS sold for $1,127, which is $192 more than the 5.0 CGC book. Just 9 days after the CGC 5.0 sold for $935, there was a 9.0 that sold for $14,999, which eclipsed the CBCS 9.0, which sold for only $3,306 just a month prior to. I'll tell you that the results thus far are pretty confounding. Like, there are a lot of factors at play here, whether you're talking about time, whether you're talking about where books were sold, the different grades, the values that are being seen. Generally speaking, the only thing that I think we can derive from this is that generally CBCS books sell for less. Next, we looked at Batman 227, specifically a graded 7.0. The CBCS book sold for $565 in early 2022, and the CGC sold for $939 or $374 more just 3 months later. The value gap is a little more narrow with the next book. We specifically looked at Teen Titans issue number 12, The First Batman Who Laughs. These books sold about a month apart, and the delta between the two was $119. The CGC 9.8 sold for $599, and the CBCS sold for $480. Sticking with the DC theme, we looked next at Batman 181, The First Poison Ivy. The delta between these 4.5s was about $240. The CBCS book sold for $860 and the CGC $1,100. Due to the popularity of the Moon Knight show on the Disney Plus streaming platform, we decided to take a look at Moon Knight issue number 1 from 1980. And what we saw there is that a CBCS 9.4 sold for $153 less than a CGC book, which sold for $240. The value gap was a little more narrow for Thor issue number 1 at a 9.8. The gap between these two books was only $23. A CBCS book sold for $276 and a CGC book sold for $299. Given the popularity of X-Men and the fact that X-Men number 1 has showed up consistently on my top 10 most submitted books in the CGC video for the last year, it felt only right to take some time to look specifically at this book. In this case, the time gap was only 1 day apart between the two sales, but the value gap was $47 in favor of CBCS. A CBCS 9.8 of X-Men 1 sold on May 3rd for $145, and on May 4th, a CGC version sold for only $98. We're in the home stretch now. We're going to look at two more books, two books related to Venom, both of which have appeared on my top 10 CGC list over the last year, so again, it only feels right that we take a look at these. The very first book that we're going to look at is Venom Lethal Protector issue number 1, specifically a CBCS 9.8 that sold for $135, and a few days later, a CGC copy sold for $200, representing a delta of $65. Lastly, ASM 300, a CBCS 8.0 sold on April 20th for $680, and on May 3rd, a CGC sold for $725, which is only a $45 difference between the two. As I said earlier in this video, I am at a loss for just how many things we can conclude from this small sample that we've looked at. What I can say is that it appears that there is a value gap between CBCS and CGC. That value gap tends to favor CGC, but not in every case. Is the value gap narrowing? I have no clue. Will the value gap always be there? I have no clue. Only time will tell. And I think one of the best things that we can potentially do is to continue doing videos like this over time, evaluating what is happening. And I think from looking at a larger data set over time, we may be able to draw more definitive conclusions. Again, I want to give a huge shout out to Matt Woods for the assistance with this video. I could not have done it without you, so I'm very thankful. If you enjoyed this video, I definitely want to encourage you to give the video a thumbs up. If you have other thoughts as to maybe what we can derive from this data based upon what was represented here, I encourage you to leave those thoughts down in the comment section. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I again want to encourage you to go ahead and do that. Tap the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and that way you won't miss out on any of the content that comes out from the channel. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.